Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. We've been talking recently about Shostakovich's Suite on Verses by Michelangelo, an amazing late work that rumor has it, at least according to his son, that he had intended to call his 16th Symphony, sort of an answer perhaps to the 14th Symphony, which ends with a vision of death. Death is all-encompassing, where here he speaks of eternity, of immortality through creativity, which was the only immortality Shostakovich really knew and was rooting for. Anyway, it's a fabulous piece, an absolutely wonderful work for bass soloist and orchestra, or piano, but the orchestral version is the one that has become most popular. Very, very sparsely scored. He was very sick when he wrote it, and he had to express what he wanted to express with a minimum of notes, notwithstanding which it calls for a fairly large orchestra with a substantial brass section. It's just powerful and haunting, and the poetry is beautiful too. I read some of it when we talked about the Alpha recording with Miko Frank conducting. That was really a very fine, and Matthias Goerne, I think, is the soloist there, who's excellent. But here we have Riccardo Muti with the Chicago Symphony on their own label, CSO Resound, and the soloist is Ildar Abdrazakov, who is a wonderful real bass. Goerne is a baritone, but he's a real bass with a darkness to his voice and a richness to his timbre that really is fabulous. And it's not such a heavy voice that he can't move it around when he needs to in the poems, that require a certain amount of agility, like, anger or rage or whatever it's called here. Wrath, pardon me. It's called wrath. Or the lightness at the very end for immortality. Really, it's an extraordinary piece. And I can't recommend it strongly enough. And this particular version, I must say, comes with complete texts and translations in multiple languages, which is really, really necessary because you do want to follow the words here. The setting is so sensitive. But what makes this particular release, I think, extraordinarily important and wonderful is the fact that it also contains Schoenberg's rarely heard Kol Nidrei. Really amazing, a 15-minute long work for narrator and chorus. Now, as you know, I usually detest things that have narrators, especially weird religious texts with narrators. But this weird religious text happens to be, it's really well done. I mean, Schoenberg was a master. He really was at melodrama, which is the idea of setting music to spoken words, because that's a lot of what he did. Remember, a lot of his vocal music is Sprechstimme, which is sung speech. It's a quasi-mixture, it's a mixture of spoken at pitch and declamation with, note intervals indicated. And so he really knew what he was doing when he had a speaker and a text. And I must say, this particular work is in English, and it's tonal. I mean, really tonal, although it has its Schoenbergosity. Of course, the choral writing that sounds really, really difficult, and it ventures into some dissonant byways, but nothing that's impossible to listen to. It was composed around 1934, I believe it was, or was it 38? Let me just check here. This is actually, the story is kind of marvelous. I mean, it's something that you could fantasize about. 1938, for the Fairfax Temple in Los Angeles, which was a liberal temple. I mean, it had to be a liberal temple. They had their Yom Kippur services in the Coconut Grove Ballroom in the Ambassador Hotel. It was their swinging Kol Nidrei service. I can imagine it must have just been a delight. And the rabbi's name was Jacob Sonderling, and he asked Schoenberg to do a new setting for his temple choir of the Kol Nidrei. Little did he know what he was in for. Well, I just have this vision of the conversation. I really do. Schoenberg had been dabbling, as a Christian convert for about a decade and a bit. And he returned to Judaism after leaving Germany, I think it was 1934, somewhere around there. And so the conversation must have been something like, hey, Arnie, What do you want, Jake? Well, as long as you're here, I would really appreciate it if you might consider doing a setting for us of Kol Nidrei. In English, of course, we're a Reformed congregation. And Schoenberg thought about it and said, sure, no problem. It sounds like fun. And Rabbi Sonderling said, oh, and by the way, I would really appreciate it if you don't do it like the way that you did some of that other stuff, if you know what I mean, like the 12-tone thing, if you would, like, we are an amateur group and reform. And Schoenberg looked at him, I'm sure, narrowed his eyes into slits and said, well, yeah, sure, it's no problem. I don't worry about it. I know what we need to do. And what he did was this extravaganza for narrator and chorus and large orchestra that answers the musical question, even Kol Nidrei is better with a tam-tam. Yes, indeed, much better. And he composed, of course, the text himself. He didn't quite like the entire Kol Nidrei text doctrinally, so he diddled it and has this rabbi do a narration from the Kabbalah. And it's like, oh my goodness. I mean, but he researched his stuff. He took it very, very seriously. It really is. And it's a beautiful, heartfelt, powerful setting. I mean, it really is. I say that with all seriousness. It's just terrific. It's amazing that so few people know this setting, know this work of Schoenberg, because people who are afraid of Schoenberg or who think that he was always, out to be like, nasty and distant and all that, I mean, they have really, really will have a sea change in their opinion of him when they hear this, because he did write something which is approachable and performable. I'm not sure by like your average synagogue choir, but and symphony orchestra and narrator. But it's a really thoughtful and interesting response to the text, and quite haunting. He does use the traditional Kol Nidrei melody. Kol Nidrei vesarei. That bit, that's in there. After that, he looked at all different versions of the melodies and sort of assembled his own version of it, but it comes back multiple times so you can actually hear it, and it's really, really good. I mean, nobody pays attention to it because it's 15 minutes long, and Schoenberg is supposed to be, Pierrot Lunaire and Moses and Aaron when it comes to that stuff, but it's great. It is absolutely great, and this performance is really stunning. It's fantastic. The narrator is Alberto Mizrahi, and he's very, very good. I mean, he sounds otherworldly and, inflects the text without sounding stiff. It sounds ritualistic. It sounds prayerful, but it's not, just kind of like grotesque the way a lot of that narration stuff can sound. It's really, really fabulous. And so that raises this entire production, I think, to an entirely new level, because you've got an absolutely first-class version of the Shostakovich Suite on Verses by Michelangelo, and this rarity, which certainly deserves the attention. So kudos to all concerned. I think this is an absolutely fantastic album. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.